and this is how I map a character in the Bible. Hello friends, today I'm going to show you how you can map a character in the Bible. And the character that I chose today is Abigail. Now Abigail is actually one of the examples that I have in the journal. Some of you may be more visual, so I hope this video will be helpful to you that are more visual. I will also show you on how I come up with these different things, my thought process and things that I put on my notes and applications, etc. So some of that information may not be in the example in the journal. So I hope you will be benefited from this. But before we map anything, one of the first things that I usually do is I read. So this is when I go to my Bible. This is actually a journal Bible, King James Version. And the story of Abigail is in 1 Samuel 25, chapter 25. So basically what I usually do is I read first. I gather all of the information that I want to include in my map. Okay, so now we're on 1 Samuel chapter 25. And the story is basically the whole chapter. So I would be reading this and also making notes on what I want to include in my map. And you can use a journal, like a paper journal, like a scratch paper, or you can use a digital one like what I usually do, because I don't like to buy another book or another journal. So I usually use my digital note-taking app. And this is an Android, so Android comes with its own note-taking app, or you can use anything that you have on your app. You can get a free one, or Apple should have one also, but I don't know what it's called. So that's what I would usually do. I would read and take notes on what jumps out to me and what I want to include in my map. So because the map is already done, I'm not going to do that right now. So I'm going to put this aside. Okay, so now that I have everything that I want to include in my map, I'm going to start mapping. So this is a blank template of a map. And I'm going to tell you what I'm going to use today as my mapping tools. Now, I don't have a brush pen. So for any lettering, I'm going to use Pigma Micron 05. I think it's 5 milliliter. It's black ink. So I'm going to trace my, my letters and make it thicker when it needs to be thicker. So it's basically cheating. But if you have a brush pen, you can use that. And if you're proficient in using it, then go ahead. But at this point, I'm kind of new in lettering. So I'm just going to use this Pigma Micron. And also for writing, I like something that is a kind of thin line. So I'm going to be using Pilot G205 or 5 milliliter. This I think is a little bit too thin for me, but it works okay for now. So, and I don't want to buy another one, so I'm just going to use this for my, for just regular writing. And for any highlighting, I'm going to be using Crayola Super tips. And you can use this as a brush pen as well, but I find that it's harder for me to use it now. I need more practice. So I'm just going to use this as a highlighter instead of a brush pen. So that's what I'm going to use, and I'm going to show you, also tell you about how I pick my colors and everything. So I can put those there. So the first thing that I'm going to do is basically write down my scripture reference. So 1 Samuel 25, that's what I'm going to write. Now I'm going to thicken the areas that need to be thickened. Normally you don't have to do this with a brush pen, but since I'm cheating, I have to do this manually. And sometimes you get a cleaner look with using it this way. Now if you are good in lettering, you can be creative about it, and I'm just doing something basic here. Now, the next thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to write down the name of the character in the circle in the middle. And if there's any text that jumps out that explains about the character of that person in general, I would write it down here, or just like a background story, I would write it down here. Now, in the case of Abigail, I read in 1 Samuel 25, verse 3, that she is a woman, or she was a woman of good understanding and of a beautiful countenance. So I'm going to write that down here. So I'm going to do some hand lettering of Abigail, and then I'll write down that text. Once again, I'm just going to thicken the lines that need to be thickened, the downstrokes basically. Sometimes I have to think which one that needs to be thickened. Now, if you don't know how to do hand lettering, you can just write it down the way you want to. You don't have to be fancy. And I'm going to write down that text. Now, this is just an option. You can do whatever you want. You can do the whole name in this circle. You don't have to put down any verse, but if that's, I'm just giving you an idea what to do here. So the next thing that I like to do is I like to define or try to find the meaning of the name. The tool that I'm using for that is called an app, Blue Letter Bible. So it comes as an app, or you can open it in your desktop. So I just go to the text, which is 1 Samuel 25, verse 3. And then I go to interlinear. I tap on the text, and then this will show up. And I go to interlinear. And then I scroll down to find Abigail. As you can see here, Abigail here is H26. That's basically the Hebrew Strong's number. So I go and click that. And it will take me to what the meaning of the name. So Abigail is my father is joy. And you can also see here that the root word for Abigail comes from the Hebrew word H1 and another one H1524. So I'm going to click that and see what that means, what that word means. And I'm going to click on the second word that makes up the word Abigail and what that means. So I'm going to write that down on my map. All right, so I wrote down what the word Abigail means, and then I'm going to write down the two words that made up the word Abigail. So the first word is ab. And I like to write down the meaning of that word underneath that word, and it means father. And do a plus sign, and the second word is Gil, and that word means a rejoicing. Such a pretty name. So in the journal, the example of the diagram or of the map, the points are circled. I'm not going to do that here. As I continue doing this, I don't quite like how the circles look on my map, especially when I have a lot of information. I feel the circles are kind of limiting my space. So I'm going to leave the writings open and I'm going to connect them later. I'm not going to color this now because I like to wait until the end and to know how many colors I need, how many points I make, and how my color scheme will work out. So I usually leave the coloring at the end. But if coloring is something that you want to do now, go ahead and do that. If you are sure what colors you're going to use, then go ahead and color right away if that's what you choose to do. I like to color at the end when everything is done and finished. So the next thing that I usually do, and I draw the arrow connecting the points I'm making. I do this now so that I'm not confused later on towards the end, because sometimes I forget and then I would draw the wrong arrow to the wrong thing. So I draw the arrow now. The second thing I want to map actually comes from verses 18, 23, and 42 in 1 Samuel 25. I noticed that, Abigail acted quickly. She made haste. That phrase, mentioned 3 times. So she acted quickly. So I want to write that down. And I will also include the phrase from the verse. Abigail made haste. And I will include the verses that mention that phrase, which are 18, 23, and 42. So I ponder upon this fact that Abigail made haste. So I ponder upon that, and I think it takes 3 things for someone to be able to act quickly in a time of a crisis. 1, it takes good judgment to be able to make that decision or to take that action. 2nd, it also takes determination to follow through with that decision, because you're going to make a decision and then you stop following up and you don't follow through and ended up not actually doing it. But Abigail was determined to follow through with her decision. And also the last thing, and I think it takes faith. She did not know what the result or the implication of her action, but she did it anyway by faith. So I think those are 3 qualities that Abigail had. Okay, I just realized that I've been using this Micron to write down the points I'm making in my map. I did say that I was going to use the Pilot G2. But anyway, you can also use the Micron for writing or this one. So it doesn't really matter. I just wanted to preserve this, just keep it for lettering purposes instead of writing. But either way, they both can write well. So the next thing that I noticed from reading 1 Samuel 25 is that Abigail made provisions to meet a need, the need of David and his friends. So in verse 18, it mentioned that she made provisions. So that kind of reminded me about Proverbs 31 woman that also made provision for his family. I'm going to write that down as my 3rd point. And I'm going to write down where that verse is found, verse 18. And I also like to include some text that can explain the point I'm making instead of me making my own personal observation. So in this case, Proverbs 31 explains my 3rd point, or my 3rd point. So I'm going to write that down here in my map. You can also write that down under cross references, but I'm going to write it in my map. So it's really up to you. There is no right or wrong on how to map. It's really about what you want to do. So I'm going to write that Proverbs 31 verses 14 and 20. And I'm going to draw my lines. So another thing that I noticed about Abigail on verse 19, she did not tell her husband about what she was going to do. And, that is something kind of odd for a woman that is supposed to be submissive. When you think of a submissive woman, they usually would do everything according to what their husband says and will involve their husband in everything. But at this time, Abigail acted independently of her husband, and I think that's worth of a notice. So I'm going to write that down as my next point. and that is on verse 19. And from the story of Abigail, I made a conclusion that there are circumstances when it's proper for a woman to act promptly and independently, moving with decision in the way she knows to be the way of the Lord. So the key is she needed to know the way of the Lord. So I'm going to write my observation down. All right, I'm going to draw my lines. All right, the next thing I noticed about Abigail is that she didn't do anything wrong, but she included herself in the sin of her husband. You notice that on verse 28. So I'm going to write that down as my next point. So the next thing that I noticed about Abigail on verse 24 is that she called David Lord. And I think it's a way of her trying to show reverence and kindness to kind of appease David that was angry at that time. And it worked. And I think it takes wisdom for you to know what to do to appease someone's anger. And what she did was working. So I'm going to write that down. And I'm going to draw my lines. I could make more points here, but I just want to do something simple, something that you can follow here. You can go ahead and add some more things that you observe about Abigail in 1 Samuel 25 and add it onto your map. But this is just a simple way on how you can map a Bible character. And so the next thing that I usually do is context. And there are about 2 ways on how you can do about this. Now, some like to have the context of the book where the character is coming from. So, for example, the context of 1 Samuel. Or you can do the immediate context, the context of the story itself. So I like to do that. Sometimes the book context doesn't give me a lot of information and doesn't really apply to what I'm trying to map. So I like to just use the immediate context, which is the story, the context of the story. So in the journal, I did not do who, what, when, where, how, but you definitely can do that. This is a blank canvas. You can do however you want. So I'm going to do that for this purpose of this video. I'm going to do who and what format. So the first thing I'm going to do is who are involved in this story. Of course, Nabal, David, and Abigail. I do want to make a note that Nabal was a wealthy man and had the ability to provide. And I got that from verse 36. You can see that in verse 36. So Nabal was not like someone who was poor and could not afford to help David, but he was wealthy and he had the means to help David. He just chose not to help him. The next thing I'm going to do is when. Now, to find out about when of the story, I actually did some Googling, so I don't really have a set methodical tools that I can show you on how to find out the when part and things like that. I actually did some Googling and see what people wrote about the background of this story. So I found out that this story happened during a shearing time. Because Nabal had a lot of camels and flocks at that time, a shearing time became not only time to work but also a festivity. So I'm going to write that down here. It was during a shearing time. Shearing time, a time to work and of festivity. I also do what. What is basically what is going on in the story. So I'm going to write down that attention arose because Nabal refused to make provisions for David and his men, who had treated Nabal's shepherds and herds nicely. The next thing I'm going to do is cross-references. Now there are tools on how you can find cross-references for certain verses, but since we're dealing with a character, so you can't always find cross-references that way. So one of the things that I like to focus on is what is the character of the person. Abigail was a wise woman. So I would look up text about wisdom and how to get wisdom. So that's what I'm going to put here. And also you can also use Proverbs 31 that kind of resonates with Abigail's character. You can also write those down here. So for the purpose of this video, I'm just going to give you 2 cross references. You can use Blue Letter Bible and do a word search for wisdom or wise and see if you can find text that would match with your character or any word that jumps out in your reading. Maybe there are same phrases that are used somewhere else in the Bible. So you can do a word search using the same tool, Blue Letter Bible. One thing that I'm going to write down in my cross references is how Abigail spoke. She spoke softly, and that reminded me with Proverbs 15 verse 1, a soft answer turneth away wrath. So I'm going to write that down here. Also, there's another text that talks about wives submitting to their husband. And that's kind of the opposite of what's going on here with Abigail, but I think it's a good cross-references. So as a general rule, wives are supposed to submit to the husband, but there are special circumstances, especially when your husband is not in the Lord. So there are circumstances when a wife can act independently, only as you see it to be the way of the Lord. That's the key. So I'm going to write down Colossians 3, verse 18. Of course, you can fill up this section with more text, and I'm just going to give you 2 examples for the sake of the video. Next, I'm moving to this dotted section. This is the section where you can be creative and kind of personalize what you want to write here. You can write about more notes. Maybe there are more background story to the character that you are mapping, or you can write down applications, actions of the things that you want to execute in your life based from this map, or reflection, how you are reflecting about the story and the character, or even a prayer. I'm not a prayer person. I don't like to journal my prayer because I think my prayer should only be heard by God and shouldn't be written down. I pray better when I'm praying silently instead of writing it down. So I don't like doing prayer on my journal. However, I do like notes. I like more background story of what's going on. So I do that, and I also like to reflect and apply. So I like those 3 sections the most. That depends on what kind of mapping I'm doing. If I'm doing Bible verse mapping, I do paraphrase and other translations and stuff like that. So for this map, the first thing I'm going to do is notes. And I'm going to do my hand lettering for each heading. Some of the information that I put under notes come from basically Googling blogs, Christian blogs, about more information about this story. So I don't have a particular source for you, but I'm sure there are dictionaries, Bible dictionaries out there that would give you more background story of each chapter or each book. So this particular information about Nabal and Abigail, I got this from online source, nothing specific. So I found out that Nabal lived in Maon, I'm not sure how to say it, and he also owned a property in Carmel. And because of the shearing time, most likely Nabal was in Carmel at that time. I don't know why, but I just think like this is a very good information to know, especially talking about the shearing time. And also, maybe you want to find out about whether arranged marriages were common back in the day. Abigail's marriage to Nabal was most likely to be arranged. So I'm going to write those things down here. One of the observations that I made, I was wondering whether Abigail knew that David already had a wife. And if she had known that, was that a wise move that she did by accepting to be David's wife? So that's just a question that I have, and a thought to ponder, and I like to include that in under my notes. All right, now that I'm finished with notes, the notes section, I'm going to move on to my next one, which is applications. And sometimes I do reflections, so it's they're kind of interchangeable. So I'm going to do my hand lettering for applications. Okay, so the first application that I'm going to write is actually another observation. Abigail had wisdom, discernment, and understanding, and those things are very important, especially during a crisis. But a crisis does not form a character. It forms a character to a degree, but a crisis most likely will reveal what is already there. So wisdom and discernment and understanding, these things have to be cultivated before to be exercised during a crisis. And also, I had another question when I was mapping this. How can I obtain this wisdom and understanding, just like Abigail? And so I did a little search with the Blue Letter Bible again, trying to find how to obtain wisdom. And I found some text from Proverbs about how to get wisdom. So I'm going to write those down here. I technically can write those verses in cross-references, but I wanted to save them for my application. So this could be like a little Bible study in a map. All right, so I'm going to end it there. And since this is just a simple example on how you can map a Bible character. So I also want to mention that you can make this last section to be as personable as possible. So what I like to do, usually just reflect back on what I map. If there are good points that I can apply in my life, this is where I put them. So this last section, applications or reflections, however you want to call them, those are the places where your map can be personal just for you. So the last thing that I do, maybe not quite the last thing, but one of the last things that I do is I find out how many colors do I need. So usually what I do, I pick one color as my main color to color the main general things such as the Bible text reference and then these boxes and also highlighting these heading sections. So, and then the next thing, I count how many points I make because I like to color code and I like to make my points different colors, and I like to color the same things with the same color so I know that they are connected. So in this case, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 colors. I will need 7 colors. So for this map, I am choosing these color scheme in the pink family and also some purple, different purples. So I'm going to choose this purple as my main color. So I'm going to color everything that needs this color, such as the Bible text reference, the boxes, and also the headings. I also like to color this circle in the middle, so I'm going to trace Abigail with this color and highlight things that are important. I'm going to color my first point of my map, which is Abigail's name in Hebrew and what it means. Then second color for my second point. Third color. Fourth color. For the context, reference, notes, applications, or this dotted section, I do like to use my main color for things that are not related to each point in the map. So for like the context, I use the general color. And for the cross references, I'm going to use the same color with my main color. And if there are some good important notes that needs to be highlighted, that's where I would highlight. So I like this part when it talks about that wisdom is not obtained during a crisis, and it has to be cultivated before a crisis. And how to obtain wisdom and understanding, I think those are good points. When I pick my color scheme for a map, I usually make a color swatch on a piece of paper to make sure that the combination looks good and that those are the colors that I want. So usually I would just do a stroke of each color that I want. If you're picky about your colors and if you have a lot of highlighters like me, this Crayola Super tips come in 50 in a set. So I do want to make sure that my colors will come out nicely and that they will go together. So that's why I always do a swatch before I start my map. But if you have just one set of highlighters and you don't care much about your colors, so just go ahead and start coloring. You don't have to do swatch. So this is really optional. I just want to give you that idea. And this is how I map a character in the Bible.